Honestly, I'm just so exhausted even thinking about how blindingly bright Gary's neon vest was that day. I mean, it literally gave me a migraine. It's dealing with guys like him that made me start sovereign ruling in the first place, I guess. Anyway, let's just dive into it. Have you ever looked at a patch of dirt and thought, this is going to cost the city government $20,000 and their remaining shreds of dignity? No? Just me? I figured. But let me tell you, when you buy a house in a quiet, supposedly unassuming suburb of Des Moines, Iowa, you don't expect your front yard to become ground zero for a legal war of attrition. I had just ripped up my water-guzzling, pathetic excuse for a lawn. I mapped out the whole project on a Notion board, sectioning off zones for native Iowa wildflowers. It was brilliant. The bees loved it. The butterflies loved it. My water bill loved it. But Gary did not love it. Gary was a code enforcement officer. His entire sense of authority was derived from a clipboard, a slight power trip, and a neon green safety vest that was entirely unnecessary for a residential sidewalk. I was out there watering some fresh black-eyed Susans when he waddled up my driveway. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask about the flowers. He just aggressively clicked his pen and started writing. "You've got a violation," Gary grunted, tearing off a pink carbon copy and holding it out to me like it was a summons to the Supreme Court. "Unauthorized landscaping and noxious weeds. You have 48 hours to clear this brush and lay down approved turf, or it's a $500 daily fine." I stared at him, genuinely thinking it was a joke. "Gary," I said, reading his name tag. "These are native pollinators. There's not a single weed here. It's a planned ecological landscape." "Code says grass," Gary replied, tapping his clipboard with a stubby finger. "It ain't grass, it's a weed. Sign here." I didn't sign. Instead, I calmly explained that a city ordinance regarding noxious weeds explicitly targets invasive species, not intentionally planted local flora. Gary didn't care. He just slapped the citation on my mailbox, gave me a look that suggested he enjoyed ruining my afternoon, and drove off in his little white city truck. By the end of the week, I had 3 citations. By the end of the month, the city sent a notice of intent to cure, which is a fancy legal way of saying they were going to send bulldozers to my house, rip up my flowers, plant cheap sod, and stick a lien on my house for the bill. They really thought I was just going to roll over and pay, but they had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. I let the first few fines sit on my kitchen counter like a weird, passive-aggressive centerpiece. Honestly, at first, I thought they were just going to give up. I mean, it's a few flowers, right? But then the letters started getting angrier. The pink slips turned into yellow slips. And then they graduated to certified mail with the big, scary red stamps on the envelopes. Every time the mail carrier walked up the driveway, he just gave me this look, like a mix of pity and deep confusion. I started logging every single piece of correspondence into a ClickUp workspace I named the Gary situation. Every date, every code citation, every misspelled word in Gary's reports. I had a whole Gantt chart mapping out their escalation tactics. It was getting ridiculous. By day 14, the fines had stacked up to a theoretical $7,000. I say theoretical because there was absolutely no way on God's green earth I was going to pay a single dime of it. I was standing in the kitchen, brewing my morning coffee, when I heard it. The unmistakable guttural rumble of a heavy-duty diesel engine, followed by the hydraulic hiss of air brakes right outside my front window. I peeked through the blinds. There, parked illegally across my driveway, was a massive yellow front-end loader attached to a flatbed truck. Behind it was a white city utility van. And behind that, parked at a sharp, aggressive angle with the light bar lazily spinning, was a Des Moines Police Department cruiser. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I mean, you kind of have to respect the absolute overkill of the municipal government. They brought heavy machinery and armed guards to fight a patch of black-eyed Susans and some purple cone flowers. I grabbed my folder from the kitchen island, the one I had spent the last 48 hours compiling, and walked out the front door. The morning air was crisp, but you could already feel the tension radiating off the sidewalk. Gary was standing there, practically vibrating with smugness, his neon vest zipped up to his chin. He was flanked by 3 guys in dirty work boots holding shovels and rakes, looking like they'd rather be literally anywhere else. And then there were the 2 cops. One was a younger guy, maybe mid-20s, resting his thumbs in his duty belt, looking completely bored. The other was an older sergeant with a graying mustache and a face that said he was about 3 weeks away from retirement and deeply annoyed to be here. "Morning, Gary," I said, leaning against my porch railing. "Brought the whole squad today, huh? Honestly, I'm a little flattered." Gary pointed a stubby finger at my face. "Time's up, pal. We issued the notice of intent to cure. You didn't comply. Now the city is stepping in to clear this public nuisance, and you're getting billed for the labor, the equipment rental, and the administrative overhead." I looked over at the older cop. "Officer, are you guys here to arrest me for aggravated horticulture? Or is this a civil matter? Because last I checked, planting native perennials wasn't a felony in Polk County." The sergeant sighed, adjusting his belt. "Sir, we're just here to keep the peace. The Code Enforcement Office requested an escort to execute a property abatement. We're not here to arrest anyone unless you cause a disturbance. Just step aside and let them do their job." Right, keeping the peace," I nodded, walking slowly down the steps. "I get it, but hypothetically, if they step onto my property and start destroying it without proper legal authorization, that would be trespassing and vandalism, right? And as peace officers, you'd have to stop them?" Gary scoffed, waving his clipboard in the air. "I have the authorization right here, Section 42, Article 3 of the Des Moines Municipal Code. We have the right to abate a nuisance." "Gary buddy, a municipal code isn't a court order," I said, my voice entirely too calm for the situation. "It's a city policy, and a city policy doesn't supersede my Fourth Amendment right against unreasonable seizure of my property. So unless you have a warrant signed by a judge in that little clipboard of yours, you're about to commit a crime." The younger cop looked at his sergeant. You could see the wheels turning in his head. The sergeant frowned, stepping forward slightly. "Listen, son, they have a work order. If you have a problem with the city code, you take it up with the zoning board or you go to court. But right now, they are going to clear this yard." "Well, it's funny you mention going to court," I said, casually flipping open my manila folder. I pulled out a stack of paper, crisp and heavily stamped with blue ink. "Because I did." I walked over and handed the top document to the sergeant. He took it, his eyes scanning the page, and his bushy eyebrows immediately shot up. "What is that?" Gary demanded, stepping forward to look over the cop's shoulder. "That, Gary, is an emergency temporary restraining order," I said, projecting my voice so the 3 guys with the shovels could hear me clearly. "I filed it pro se at the Polk County Courthouse yesterday afternoon at 4:55 p.m. The judge was fascinated by your interpretation of the noxious weed ordinance, by the way. He signed it right on the spot." Gary's face went from smug to a shade of red that clashed violently with his safety vest. That's impossible. You can't just get an injunction against a city department." "I literally just did," I smiled. The sergeant read the document out loud, mostly for his own benefit. "Yeah. Hereby orders the City of Des Moines, its agents, employees, and contractors to immediately cease and desist any and all enforcement actions, including but not limited to the physical alteration of the property located at—" Well, he's right, Gary. This has a judge's signature. It's an active TRO. "It's a trick," Gary sputtered. "He probably forged it." The sergeant shot Gary a look of pure exhaustion. "Gary, it has the raised seal from the clerk of courts. It's real. And this order explicitly states we cannot touch this property until a preliminary hearing is held. When is the hearing? Gary demanded. I checked my watch. According to the docket, we have a hearing scheduled for exactly 72 hours from now, Friday morning. Which means if any of those boots or that shiny yellow tractor cross my property line before then, they are in contempt of court. And officer, I looked at the sergeant, I assume you'd have to enforce a judge's direct order, wouldn't you? The sergeant looked from the paper to Gary to the giant patch of yellow and purple flowers, and then back to me. He let out a long, heavy breath and handed the paper back. He's got you, Gary. We're done here. What do you mean we're done here? Gary shrieked. His voice actually cracked. I have a crew on the clock. We rented that loader. You're just going to let him get away with this? I am going to get in my cruiser, and I am going to go get a coffee, the sergeant said flatly. Because my jurisdiction ends where a judge's order begins. Pack it up, guys. The three landscapers didn't even hesitate. They immediately tossed their shovels into the back of the flatbed, looking genuinely relieved they didn't have to spend their morning arguing. The younger cop was actually trying to hide a smile as he walked back to the cruiser. Gary stood on the sidewalk, practically vibrating with rage. He looked at the retreating police car, then at the idling front-end loader, and finally, at me. If looks could spontaneously combust organic matter, my entire front yard would have been ash. You think you're so smart, Gary hissed, pointing his pen at me like a weapon. This is a delay tactic. That's all this is. In 72 hours, that judge is going to look at the zoning code, he's going to laugh in your face, and he's going to lift that order. And when he does, I'm coming back. And I'm going to rip every single one of these ugly weeds out of the dirt myself. I mean, I'd love to see you try manual labor, Gary. It'd probably be good for your cardio, I replied. But you're right. It is a delay tactic. I just needed a little time to finish some paperwork. Gary stormed off, climbed into his little white truck, and slammed the door so hard I thought the window was going to shatter. He peeled away from the curb, followed closely by the heavy machinery. I stood on my porch, listening to the diesel engine fade into the distance, leaving my quiet suburban street exactly as it was. I looked down at the flowers. The bees were still buzzing. I took another sip of my coffee. I had bought myself exactly 72 hours. 3 days. That was all the time I had to execute a plan so legally convoluted, so deeply entrenched in municipal bureaucracy that it would make Gary's head spin right off his shoulders. I went back inside, booted up my computer, and opened a fresh browser window. I didn't need to win a fight about whether my flowers were weeds. That was a losing battle against a city with deep pockets and a stubborn zoning board. No. I needed to change the rules of the game entirely. I navigated to the Des Moines city government portal and pulled up the complete, unabridged, 1,000-page PDF of the municipal zoning code. I spent the next 14 hours straight reading through zoning ordinances. My eyes were burning, my brain felt like it was leaking out of my ears, and I was running purely on caffeine and spite. I was looking for a loophole. Not just a small one, but a massive, gaping hole in the city's logic. Cities are designed by committees, and committees always contradict themselves. You just have to find where the right hand didn't know what the left hand was writing. I started digging into commercial zoning, residential exemptions, agricultural overlays. Nothing was fitting. I was about to give up around 2 a.m. I was literally resting my head on my desk, randomly scrolling through Section 134, Article 5, Public and Civic Uses, when a specific phrase caught my eye. I sat up, blinking against the blue light of the monitor. There it was, buried under a subsection originally drafted in the late 90s for downtown corporate developments. It was an ordinance regarding privately owned public spaces, or POPs. I started reading, and as I read, A slow, malicious grin spread across my face. According to the code, the city wanted to encourage developers to create public parks and rest areas without the city having to buy the land. So they created a massive incentive. If a private property owner voluntarily recorded a public access easement against their deed, granting the general public the right to access a specific portion of their land, that portion of land was legally reclassified from a residential frontage to a public recreation area. But here was the kicker. The absolute beautiful kicker. Under Section 134 to 5.2, Maintenance of Public Recreation Areas, the code explicitly stated that designated public recreation spaces were strictly exempt from standard residential lawn height maximums because they were legally protected to maintain natural topography and native flora for the enjoyment of the public. If I turned my front yard into a park, Gary's residential codebook meant absolutely nothing. He would have zero jurisdiction. But I couldn't just say it was a park. The code had stipulations. To qualify for the POPs designation and the subsequent reclassification, the easement area had to provide a minimum of 3 specific civic amenities accessible from the public right-of-way. Amenity 1. A permanent affixed seating structure, a bench. Amenity 2. A paved ADA-compliant accessibility path. Amenity 3. A municipal standard waste receptacle. I read the text over and over again. I cross-referenced it with the state property laws. I checked the definitions. There was no minimum size requirement for a POPs. There was no restriction saying it couldn't be a residential front yard in the suburbs. It was a blank check written by a sloppy city council 30 years ago, and I was about to cash it. I didn't just have a defense. I had a weapon. I looked at the clock. It was 3:30 a.m. I had roughly 56 hours until the TRO expired, and Gary came back with the bulldozers. I needed a lawyer to fast-track a deed restriction, a surveyor to map the easement, and I needed to construct a fully compliant public park in my front yard before the sun came up on Friday. I pulled out my phone and started making a list of contractors. This was going to cost me a small fortune, but honestly, watching Gary try to enforce a residential weed ordinance on a legally registered city park was going to be worth every single penny. I just needed to find a concrete guy crazy enough to answer his phone at dawn. I mean, honestly, trying to find a contractor who will drop absolutely everything they are doing to come pour concrete in your front yard with zero notice is basically impossible. I spent the first 2 hours of daylight just furiously scrolling through Google, calling every hardscaping and masonry company within a 50-mile radius of Des Moines. It was literally just me getting hung up on, over and over again. Most of them laughed. A few of them told me to call back in October. But eventually, around 8 in the morning, I got a guy named Big Mike on the phone. Big Mike sounded like he had been smoking a pack a day since he was 12, and his company, which I guess was just him and a couple of guys, was called something super generic like Mike's Paving and Hardscape. I didn't care. "Mike," I said, pacing around my kitchen island, "I need an ADA-compliant concrete pathway, roughly 12 feet long, poured in my front yard. I also need a commercial-grade, heavy-iron park bench securely bolted to a concrete pad, and a municipal standard metal trash receptacle anchored into the ground. And I need the concrete poured by tonight, so it cures by tomorrow." There was a very long, very heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear a truck engine idling in the background. "Buddy," Mike finally croaked, "I don't know what kind of HGTV emergency you got going on over there, but concrete needs to be framed, poured, and set. And a commercial bench? Where am I supposed to get a commercial bench by noon? You're out of your mind." "I will pay you triple your emergency rush rate," I said, not even blinking. "Cash. Today. I've already sourced the bench and the trash can from a commercial supply warehouse out in West Des Moines. I just need you to pick them up, Bring them here and put them in the ground. I mean, literally, just name your price, Mike." Another long silence. Then a heavy sigh. "Text me the address. I'll be there in 20 minutes. When Mike pulled up, it wasn't just him. He brought his hardscape specialist, Terry, who looked like a guy whose entire diet consisted of energy drinks and gas station hot dogs. They stood on my sidewalk, looking at the vibrant, chaotic patch of black-eyed Susans, milkweed, and purple cone flowers that took up my entire front yard. "Okay, so let me get this straight," Mike said, pulling a tape measure off his belt and scratching his jaw. "You want us to rip up exactly a 4-foot-wide path through these flowers, pour a sidewalk that leads to absolutely nowhere, and install a heavy-duty park bench right in the middle of it?" "Yes," I nodded, handing him the printed schematic I had drawn up in a sheer panic at 4 in the morning. Terry squinted at the paper, then looked at my house, then back at the paper. "Bro, this bench, the way you have it angled here, it's going to be facing your living room window. Like whoever sits on it is just going to be staring directly into your house. Why would you want that?" "Terry, I don't care if the bench is facing my window, the street, or the moon," I said, running a hand through my hair. "I need this bench bolted to the earth with the strength of a dying star by tomorrow morning. Don't ask questions. Just take my money and pour the concrete." Mike just shrugged, looking at Terry. "Hey, his money's as green as anyone else's. Go get the bobcat off the trailer. We gotta dig out the forms." While Mike and Terry started violently ripping a 4-foot trench through my carefully cultivated native flora, I had to run the actual legal errand. Because a physical park means nothing without the paperwork to back it up. I hopped in my car and drove straight to the Polk County Assessor's office downtown. I had drafted a public access easement and declaration of privately owned public space, using the exact verbiage I had pulled from Section 134 of the Municipal Code. The clerk at the recorder's office was this older woman who looked like she had seen every possible weird property dispute in the history of Iowa. She took my paperwork, adjusted her glasses, and read through it. "You're granting a perpetual public access easement on your front yard?" she asked, her voice dripping with extreme skepticism. "You realize this means anyone in the city can legally walk up and sit on your property and you can't tell them to leave? It essentially becomes city jurisdiction for public use." "I am fully aware of the consequences," I smiled, sliding my credit card across the counter to pay the recording fee. "I am just a deeply civic-minded individual who wants to give back to the community." She gave me a look that explicitly said she knew I was lying. But she stamped it anyway. The heavy thud of her ink stamp hitting the paper was honestly the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was official. Legally, the deed to my house now had an encumbrance. The front 30 feet of my property was officially designated as a public recreation space. By the time I got back to the house, it was pure chaos. Mike and Terry had framed out the pathway and were currently backing a small cement mixer right onto my driveway. The neighbors were starting to come out of their houses, standing on their porches with their arms crossed, whispering to each other. I mean, my yard had already been the talk of the street because of the flowers and the police visit, but now it looked like I was building a commercial strip mall. "Concrete's going in," Mike yelled over the roar of the mixer. "We picked up the bench and the trash can. Heavy-duty stuff, man. City grade. Weighs like 400 pounds. "Perfect," I yelled back, watching the gray sludge pour into the wooden forms. The rest of the afternoon and evening was a blur of power tools, loud swearing from Terry, and floodlights. Because the clock was ticking down on that 72-hour injunction, we couldn't stop when the sun went down. I had set up 4 massive halogen work lights on extension cords, illuminating my yard like a crime scene. Around 9 p.m., Mike and Terry were wrestling this massive black iron park bench into place on the freshly curing concrete pad. They used heavy-duty wedge anchors, drilling them directly into the wet cement. They did the same for the metal trash receptacle, bolting it down right next to the sidewalk, facing the street. "Honestly, man, This is the weirdest job I've ever done, Terry panted, wiping sweat off his forehead with a dirty rag as he tightened the last bolt on the trash can. It looks like a bus stop in the middle of a prairie. It's a masterpiece, Terry, I said, handing him an ice-cold Gatorade. But there was one final touch. You see, when you designate a POPS, the city code requires clear signage indicating that the space is open to the public. I hadn't just ordered a bench. I had called a local trophy and engraving shop and begged them for a same-day rush job on a bronze plaque. It cost me an arm and a leg, but it was the cornerstone of my entire revenge plot. I pulled the plaque out of a bubble wrap envelope and walked over to the bench. I had Mike drill 2 holes into the iron backrest, and I carefully screwed the bronze plate into the metal. Terry leaned over, reading it in the harsh glow of the floodlights. The Gary Memorial Wildflower Reserve, a public recreation area, open to all citizens of Des Moines. Please keep off the native flora. Who's Gary? Mike asked, packing up his drill. Did somebody die? Only a man's ego, Mike, I said, stepping back to admire the work. Only a man's ego. By midnight, the contractors were gone. My bank account was significantly lighter, and the concrete was setting. I stood on my porch and just stared at it. It was glorious. A perfectly paved, ADA-compliant walkway cutting through a wild, overgrown patch of native Iowa flowers, leading to a commercial bench and a city-standard trash can. It checked every single box of Section 134 to 5.2 of the Des Moines Municipal Zoning Code. I went inside, set my alarm, and finally went to sleep. The trap was set. The paperwork was filed. The concrete was dry. Now all I had to do was wait for the clock to run out, and for Gary to walk right into the buzzsaw. Friday morning rolled around, and honestly, I woke up feeling like a kid on Christmas. The temporary restraining order was set to officially expire at exactly 8:30 a.m. I had my alarm set for 6, just so I could enjoy a slow, peaceful cup of coffee while staring out my front window at the absolute masterpiece of malicious compliance sitting in my yard. The concrete had cured perfectly. The heavy iron bench was resolute. The municipal trash can stood proudly like a stainless steel sentinel, and the bronze plaque, the Gary Memorial Wildflower Reserve, gleamed beautifully in the early morning sun. I mean, I didn't just want to win this. I wanted to make it a spectacle. I went into my closet and pulled out a tailored suit jacket, throwing it on over a plain white t-shirt and my favorite pair of jeans. Then, I grabbed the final prop. Yesterday, while the concrete was setting, I had made a quick run to a local party supply store and dropped $30 on a pair of oversized novelty ribbon-cutting scissors and a spool of thick, red satin ribbon. By 8:15 a.m., I had tied the red ribbon across the 2 wooden stakes I'd driven into the dirt at the exact property line where my new concrete pathway met the city sidewalk. I stood on the porch, holding the giant scissors, just waiting. The neighborhood was entirely awake for this. You could literally see blinds twitching up and down the street. Old Mrs. Higgins from next door had actually pulled a lawn chair out onto her porch and was sitting there with a mug of tea. She gave me a little nod. I tipped my imaginary hat to her. Everyone knew the city was coming back. At 8:28 a.m., right on cue, the parade of municipal overreach turned the corner onto my street. It was exactly the same lineup as Wednesday. The heavy-duty yellow front-end loader leading the charge, the flatbed truck right behind it, Gary's little white utility van, and bringing up the rear, the Des Moines Police Department cruiser. They parked with the same aggressive block-the-whole-street energy. The heavy machinery sat idling, coughing black diesel smoke into the crisp morning air. The doors of the vehicles opened, and the crew stepped out. Gary looked like he was about to burst with excitement. He had his clipboard tucked firmly under his arm, his neon vest zipped up tight, and a grin so incredibly smug, it actually made my eye twitch. He was flanked by the exact same 3 landscaping guys, who still looked like they hated their lives, and the exact same 2 police officers. The older sergeant stepped out of his cruiser, took one look at the giant red ribbon, the concrete path, the bench, and the giant scissors in my hand, and just stopped dead in his tracks. He slowly took off his sunglasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Good morning, gentlemen," I called out cheerfully, walking down the steps and standing right behind the red ribbon. "Beautiful day for a civic event, wouldn't you say?" Gary marched right up to the edge of my driveway, pointing his pen at me. "The injunction expired 2 minutes ago. I checked the docket this morning. You didn't file for an extension. The judge didn't renew it, which means your little delay tactic is officially over. We are clearing this lot right now." He turned to the guy driving the loader and gave a dramatic, sweeping hand signal, like he was a general ordering a cavalry charge. "Fire it up! We're tearing out everything from the sidewalk to the porch!" The diesel engine roared, and the heavy loader lurched forward an inch. "Whoa, whoa, hold on a second!" I yelled, holding up my free hand while resting the giant scissors on my shoulder. "Gary, honestly, I'm a little hurt. You didn't even read the invitation I sent to your office?" Gary scoffed, waving his clipboard. "I don't care about whatever sovereign citizen fake legal jargon you're trying to pull today. You have noxious weeds. The code says we abate them. That's it. Officer, if he steps in front of the machinery, I want him arrested for obstructing a city worker." The older sergeant slowly walked up to the property line, standing next to Gary. He looked at the red ribbon, then at the heavy iron bench sitting in the middle of the wildflowers. "Son," the sergeant said, his voice heavy with exhaustion, "what exactly am I looking at here? Because on Wednesday, this was just a yard full of weeds. Today, it looks like a bus stop." "I am so glad you asked, Sergeant," I said, my smile widening. "Because you are currently standing on the threshold of Des Moines' newest civic amenity. Welcome to the grand opening." I brought the giant novelty scissors down and dramatically snipped the thick red ribbon in half. It fluttered to the ground. "I hereby declare the Gary Memorial Wildflower Reserve officially open to the public," I announced, gesturing grandly to the concrete path and the bench. Gary stared at me like I had completely lost my mind. The 3 landscapers were leaning on their shovels, openly grinning. "Are you insane?" Gary snapped. "You poured concrete in the middle of a code violation. That just means we have to bring a jackhammer to tear it out. You just doubled your abatement bill, you idiot." "Well, Gary, I would normally agree with you," I said, reaching into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. "Except for the fact that you no longer have any jurisdiction over this piece of land." I pulled out a thick, folded packet of papers. The front page bore the heavy, raised blue seal of the Polk County Recorder's Office, complete with the timestamp from yesterday afternoon. I handed it across the property line to the sergeant. "Sergeant, as a sworn officer of the law, I'm sure you're familiar with recorded property deeds and easements, right?" I asked politely. The sergeant unfolded the packet, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. "I know enough to get by. What is this?" "That," I said loudly and clearly, "is a legally binding, perpetual public access easement. I filed it yesterday. It grants the general public the unrestricted right to access, utilize, and enjoy the front 30 feet of this property. In perpetuity." Gary blinked. I don't care. It's still your property. It still has weeds." "Ah, but Gary, you really should care," I chided, wagging a finger at him. "Because I didn't just grant an easement. I intentionally developed this space to meet the exact, stringent requirements of Section 134 to 5.2 of the Des Moines Municipal Zoning Code. Have you read Section 134, Gary?" Gary's smug expression finally started to falter. A tiny crack of uncertainty appeared in his eyes. "Section 134 is That's commercial zoning. That's for downtown plazas. It is for privately owned public spaces, or POPs, I corrected him, stepping right up to the property line so we were face to face. And there is absolutely no geographic restriction in the code preventing a POPs from being established in a residential zone. The code states that if a private owner grants public access and provides 3 specific civic amenities, which, if you look closely, are a paved walkway, a permanent seating structure, and a municipal standard waste receptacle, the land is automatically reclassified by the city. I pointed directly at the heavy iron bench. Amenity 1. I pointed at the concrete path. Amenity 2. I pointed at the trash can. Amenity 3. I leaned in closer, dropping my voice just a fraction, so he had to strain to hear me over the idling bulldozer. And as you know, Gary, because you are a code enforcement officer, under Section 134 to 5.2, any land classified as a public recreation area is strictly and explicitly exempt from residential lawn height maximums. In fact, the code legally protects natural topography and native flora within these zones for the enjoyment of the public. Gary's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at the paperwork in the sergeant's hands, then at the bench, then at the bronze plaque that literally had his name on it. "You," Gary stammered, his face draining of all color. "You can't do this. This is a residential neighborhood. You can't just declare your yard a park to get out of a fine." "I didn't declare it a park, Gary. The Polk County Assessor's Office declared it a park," I said, tapping the blue seal on the paperwork the sergeant was holding. "It is legally recorded, which means your residential code citation, your notice of intent to cure, and your entire presence on my sidewalk right now is based on a zoning classification that no longer exists." I turned to the sergeant, who was currently reading the text of the easement with a look of profound, genuine amusement. "Sergeant," I said respectfully, "as of 2:15 p.m. yesterday, this land is governed by the Parks and Recreation Department, not residential code enforcement. Gary has absolutely no legal authority to alter a registered public recreation space. If he or his bulldozer crosses that property line and damages this native flora, it is no longer a code abatement. It is the destruction of a civic amenity and felony vandalism of a protected public space." The sergeant looked up from the paperwork. He looked at Gary. He looked at the massive bulldozer. Then he looked at me. A slow, incredibly satisfying smirk spread across his face beneath his gray mustache. "Well, Gary," the sergeant drawled, handing the paperwork back to me, "looks like you're out of your jurisdiction." "No!" Gary shrieked, his voice jumping a full octave. He snatched his clipboard and started furiously flipping through pages. "This is a trick! This is a sham! He put a bench in some weeds. It's not a park. I have an order." "Gary, your order is for a residential code violation," the sergeant said, his tone shifting from amused to authoritative. "This document is a legally recorded property deed modification with a county seal. I don't care if it's a sham, a trick, or a joke. From a law enforcement perspective, this is a civil zoning dispute regarding a privately owned public space. You cannot bring heavy machinery onto a legally designated park without a specific warrant targeting this new zoning classification." But the weeds," Gary sputtered, pointing frantically at the black-eyed Susans. "They're over 6 inches tall. Section 42. "Section 42 doesn't apply to parks, Gary. You know that better than I do," the sergeant said. He keyed the radio on his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. You can clear us from this address. The abatement order is invalid due to a zoning reclassification. No enforcement action taken." The radio crackled. "Copy that, Unit 4. Gary looked like he was going to have a stroke. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped his pen. "You can't leave. You are supposed to escort my crew." "My job was to keep the peace during a lawful abatement," the sergeant replied, already turning around and walking back to his cruiser. Since the abatement is no longer lawful, there's no peace to keep. If you have an issue with the county assessor's office, take it up with the city attorney. I am not getting the Des Moines Police Department sued for bulldozing a city park. The younger cop, who had been completely silent this entire time, actually let out a loud snort of laughter before quickly covering his mouth and jogging after his sergeant. The three landscapers didn't even wait for Gary to give them an order. The moment they heard the sergeant say the abatement was invalid, the guy driving the loader immediately killed the engine, pulled the keys, and hopped out of the cab. "Hey, where are you going?" Gary yelled at him. "Man, I get paid by the hour, and I'm not getting arrested for tearing up a park," the driver said, tossing his hard hat into the back of the flatbed. "We're going on lunch. Call us when you figure out what zone we're in." The three of them piled into the cab of the flatbed truck, fired it up, and drove off down the street, leaving the massive yellow front-end loader parked haphazardly in front of my driveway. Gary was completely alone. He stood on the sidewalk, clutching his clipboard to his chest like a shield, breathing heavily. He stared at the bronze plaque on the bench. He read it again. The Gary Memorial Wildflower Reserve. I leaned casually against the heavy iron backrest of the bench. "I mean, honestly, Gary, I think the plaque is a really nice touch. I thought about naming it after the mayor, but you just put so much personal effort into this project. I felt like you deserved the recognition." Gary didn't say a single word. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten me. He just looked completely, utterly broken. The bureaucratic machine he worshipped had just been used to completely obliterate his authority, and his brain simply couldn't process it. He turned around, walked slowly to his little white city truck, climbed in, and drove away. He didn't even look back at the bulldozer he had left behind. I sat down on the bench. It was actually surprisingly comfortable. Mrs. Higgins yelled from her porch across the property line, "Is the park open for visitors?" "Always open, Mrs. Higgins," I called back. "Public access in perpetuity." I sat there in the morning sun, surrounded by bees and native flowers, watching the police cruiser turn the corner at the end of the block. They literally went straight to a diner down the road. I knew, because I saw them pull into the parking lot. The fines were dead. The bulldozers were stopped. The yard was saved. But the best part? The absolute peak of this entire malicious compliance operation? We weren't even finished yet, because establishing a privately owned public space didn't just give me legal immunity from Gary. It triggered a whole different section of the city code, a section that the city council was about to become intimately, painfully aware of at the upcoming zoning board hearing. I had trapped them in their own paperwork, and next week I was going to make them pay for the privilege of maintaining it. Honestly, I kind of assumed they would just take the L and walk away. I mean, after the police literally laughed Gary off my property and the bulldozer guy went to lunch, you'd think the city would just cut their losses, right? But if there is one thing you need to understand about municipal zoning boards, it's that they have the collective ego of a medieval king, and they absolutely hate being outsmarted by a guy in a t-shirt. So, naturally, I didn't just get a letter of dismissal. I got a formal, aggressively worded summons to a special emergency hearing of the Des Moines Zoning and Planning Commission. They wanted me in City Hall, Tuesday at 7 p.m., to address the unauthorized and fraudulent manipulation of zoning codes. I literally laughed out loud when I read it. Fraudulent? I mean, I used their exact paperwork, paid their exact filing fee, and used a municipal template. I guess it's only a loophole when the rich developers use it, right? I showed up to City Hall that Tuesday night wearing my best suit. I brought a leather briefcase that contained exactly two things: a certified copy of the public access easement and a printed copy of Section 114 of the Des Moines Municipal Code. The council chambers were exactly as depressing as you would imagine. Fluorescent lights, wood-paneled walls that hadn't been updated since 1985, and a raised dais where 5 board members sat looking down at the podium. Gary was there, sitting in the front row of the gallery. He wasn't wearing his neon vest tonight. He was in a terribly fitted polo shirt, looking like a kid who called his parents to the principal's office to back him up. Next to the board sat the city's legal counsel, a sharp-looking woman with thin glasses, who honestly looked like she was already exhausted by this entire situation. The chairman of the board, a guy named Councilman Higgins, no relation to my awesome neighbor, unfortunately, banged his little wooden gavel. "All right, let's call this circus to order," Chairman Higgins grumbled, leaning into his microphone. "We are here to discuss the property at 442 Elm Street. The property owner has apparently decided to play games with the county assessor's office to avoid paying a lawful code enforcement fine. Sir, step up to the podium and state your name for the record." I walked up to the podium, tapped the microphone, and smiled. I gave them my name. "Right," Higgins said, adjusting his reading glasses. "I have a report here from Code Enforcement Officer Gary stating that you owe the city upwards of $15,000 in accumulated fines for noxious weeds, failure to abate a public nuisance, and resisting a lawful city work order. And instead of paying it, you went downtown and filed a fake park deed. Do you honestly think we're going to let that slide?" "Well, Mr. Chairman, I guess that depends on your definition of the word fake," I said, leaning casually against the podium. "Because I have a certified, stamped document from the Polk County Recorder's Office that says my front yard is legally a privately owned public space, established under Section 134 to 5.2 of your own zoning code." "It's a loophole," Gary shouted from the front row. "He put a bench in a weed patch." "Quiet in the gallery, Gary," Higgins snapped. He looked back at me. "Listen, son. Section 134 is designed for commercial plazas downtown to provide civic seating. It is not meant for a residential front yard in the suburbs. You can't just slap a trash can on the curb and call it a park." "With all due respect, Mr. Chairman, I literally can," I replied, pulling the easement out of my briefcase and holding it up. I read the code 3 times. There is no geographic restriction on POPS designations. There is no minimum square footage. The code explicitly states that if an owner grants public access and provides 3 civic amenities, which I did, the land is reclassified as a public recreation area. And as you know, public recreation areas are legally exempt from residential weed ordinances to protect native flora. Higgins scowled. He turned to the city attorney sitting next to him and covered his microphone. "Can he do this? Tell me he can't do this." The attorney didn't bother covering her microphone. She just leaned forward, her voice echoing clearly through the chambers. "Actually, Mr. Chairman, I reviewed the filing this afternoon. His paperwork is flawless. The county assessor already updated the zoning map. By the letter of the law, that 30-foot stretch of his property is a legally protected public park. We cannot enforce a residential code on it, and any fines issued under the residential code are retroactively invalid because the jurisdiction has changed." The silence in the room was absolute gold. You could have heard a pin drop. Gary made a noise in the back of his throat that sounded like a dying squirrel. "So," Higgins stammered, his face turning a blotchy red. "So, you're telling me this guy just beat a $15,000 fine by buying a park bench?" "A park bench, an ADA-compliant concrete pathway, and a municipal standard waste receptacle," I corrected him cheerfully. "I mean, I really wanted to make sure I followed the city's standards to the letter. I take civic duty very seriously." Higgins glared at me. "Fine. You found a loophole. You win on a technicality. The fines are dismissed. But don't think for a second you're getting away with this entirely. You are now legally responsible for the upkeep of a public space. If that bench gets vandalized, or if that pathway cracks, you are liable. And we will be watching you, buddy." Meeting adjourned. "Actually, Mr. Chairman, hold on," I interrupted, raising my hand. "Before you hit that gavel, there is one more piece of business regarding the Gary Memorial Wildflower Reserve." Higgins froze. the gavel hovering an inch above the sound block. The what? The park in my yard. That's its official registered name. It's on a bronze plaque and everything. I smiled. Anyway, I'm glad you brought up the upkeep of the space. Because while it is true that I am responsible for the structural maintenance of the bench and the concrete, I am not responsible for the sanitation. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the second document. I walked over and handed it directly to the city attorney. You see, since the property is now officially recognized by the city as a public recreation area, and since it features a municipal standard waste receptacle accessible from the public right-of-way, I paused, letting the suspense build just a little bit. It now falls under the jurisdiction of Des Moines Municipal Code Section 114-5, Municipal Sanitation Duties. The city attorney quickly scanned the paper I handed her. Her eyes widened, and a tiny, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. She looked up at Higgins. "He's citing the sanitation ordinance, Mr. Chairman," the attorney said, her voice perfectly even. "According to Section 114-5, the city's Department of Public Works is legally obligated to service and empty all municipal waste receptacles located within designated public recreation areas." Higgins looked like he was going to pass out. "What does that mean? In plain English?" "It means," I said, stepping back to the microphone, "that starting this week, the city of Des Moines is legally required to send a municipal sanitation worker to my front yard to empty the tiny little trash can next to my park bench. The code mandates a minimum servicing schedule of twice a week for public parks. So I guess I will see your garbage trucks on Tuesdays and Thursdays." "You want us to send a city truck to empty a single trash can in your front yard?" Higgins yelled, completely losing his composure. "That is an absurd waste of taxpayer money." "Hey, I completely agree," I nodded sympathetically. "But the code is the code, right? We have to follow the rules. That's what Gary kept telling me when he was threatening to bulldoze my native pollinators. And honestly, if the trash can overflows because the city neglects its legally mandated duties, I'll have to file a formal complaint with the State Environmental Protection Board." Gary stood up from the gallery. "You can't make us do that. We won't do it." I didn't even look at Gary. I just kept my eyes locked on the city attorney. "Can I make them do it, counselor?" The attorney sighed, took off her glasses, and rubbed her eyes. "Mr. Chairman, yes, he can. If we recognize the zoning exemption to dismiss the fines, we have to recognize the entire zoning classification. That includes city services for the public space. We have to empty his trash can." Higgins sat back in his oversized leather chair. He looked physically deflated. He looked at Gary. He looked at the attorney. He looked at me, standing at the podium, trying desperately not to laugh into the microphone. "Tuesdays and Thursdays," Higgins whispered, staring blankly at the wall. "I prefer the morning shift, if possible," I added. "Before 9 a.m. I don't like the noise of the trucks when I'm drinking my coffee." Higgins slowly raised his gavel and let it drop onto the block with a weak, pathetic little thud. "Fines dismissed. Sanitation schedule approved. Get out of my building." I packed my briefcase, thanked the board for their time, and walked out of City Hall. The night air had never felt so crisp, so clean, and so incredibly victorious. It's been about 6 months since the hearing. The wildflowers in the Gary Memorial Wildflower Reserve are blooming beautifully. The bees are thriving. And every single Tuesday and Thursday morning at exactly 8:15 a.m., a massive, heavy-duty city sanitation truck rumbles down my quiet suburban street. It stops in front of my house. A guy in a high-visibility vest hops out, walks up my perfectly cured concrete pathway, and empties a single, mostly empty trash bag out of my municipal waste receptacle. Sometimes I sit on the heavy iron bench with my coffee and wave at him. He always waves back. He thinks the whole thing is hilarious. Gary doesn't work my route anymore. I heard he got transferred to inspecting commercial dumpsters behind strip malls on the other side of town. Honestly, I think it's a better fit for him. And that is exactly how you turn a ridiculous HOA-style city fine into a permanent monument to malicious compliance. They wanted a perfectly manicured lawn. They got a permanent, legally protected ecological reserve that costs them gas money twice a week to maintain. If there is a lesson to be learned here, it's that bureaucracy is a double-edged sword. The same thick, dense, ridiculously complicated rule book they use to bludgeon, you can absolutely be used to trap them. You just have to be willing to read the fine print, buy a park bench, and call their bluff. Have fun with this one. It's a ride.